I'm worried about the future of Monster Hunter. Recently released to great acclaim, the latest entry in the cult favourite fauna fighting franchise has been a long-awaited experience that thankfully does not disappoint. Taking that familiar formula to new heights of production value, it looks amazing, it's full of incredible high-octane moments, and crucially, it's still the Monster Hunter we all know and love. Sort of. Hunting wild beasts, carving them up for parts, building lavish and intricate weapon and armor sets with their entrails, feeling ever so slightly bad about it, but for a second before another layer of angrier, nastier creature emerges to assuage your unfounded guilt, that familiar loop is there in droves. I really like it. But the more I've been playing it, the more I've been thinking about what it is I actually value about these games, what remains, and as the series ventures into new and exciting mainstream territory, what seems to be slipping away. Monster Hunter Wilds is a lavish work for sure, but it's one with a surprisingly intrusive story campaign to start you off with, a means of onboarding new players while retaining all the mechanical complexity of the game at large. It ends up being a sort of greatest hits run through every cool thing you can do in this game, while reining in the challenge enough to encourage those of a nervous disposition to keep going. On paper, an altruistic act. First impressions count for a lot. Early entries in the franchise were frictional and dripping with obfuscation. Many hardcore fans would point to their relationship with these games coming from an introduction not from the game itself, but from other players, guiding them through their rocky first adventures until they felt confident enough to really get into the weeds with the more intricate elements of the game's mechanics and systems. I'm something of a newbie when it comes to Monster Hunter. My first entry was World, and as documented in previous videos, I've spent a fair amount of time with Rise this past year. As such, I've only come to understand this particular relationship with the series through anecdotal evidence, as my own experience has been much more user-friendly. But even with this far from journeyman's approach to the series, still I can see a slow ebb of broad appeal design decisions trickling through, appeasements to the common consensus of what games should be, admissions of a general chewiness that the franchise has always commanded, that beautifully ornate mouthfeel considered too delicate for the palates of the common man, an acquired taste made mainstream. Wilds, as the culmination of everything the series has been building towards, feels alarmingly compromised as a result. What I mean by this, and to be perfectly blunt, is that the game is streamlined to hell and back. Decisions made to remove certain spiky aspects of older design. Items once single use have now become actions identified on an ability wheel. Trails to uncover the locations of great beasts now replaced with jarring icons and a laughably canonical endemic waypoint that's all too eager to remove any risk of getting lost. They call it Wilds, but what is this if not domesticated? No stranger to this yassification of the series, one could point to many aspects of the previous two entries and see a worrying trend forming, a delicate balance of quality of life improvements rubbing up against the need to retain the frictional core of the game, the thing that keeps the sickos returning for more. The thing is, some of these decisions are welcome, while others are not, and it's quite hard to delineate from the outside. So let me tell you about one specific experience I had in Wilds that made me realize that this might be a problem. One of the things I always heard about the Monster Hunter series at large, the reason why it was so beloved by fans and also why I jumped on the bandwagon when World first released, was that it was an unusually slow burn of a game. You had to be methodical about how you approached its myriad challenges. You had to understand implicitly not only each title's core mechanics, but also the very specific idiosyncrasies of each monster, their behavior, their attack patterns, how they move, where their vulnerable spots are, what attack types they are well guarded against, how to take them down and not get your ass whooped in the process. The typical loop of these games, even in the later, more user-friendly iterations, is characterized by a challenging first encounter with each beast, crippled by the spectre of the unknown but led onward by gut instinct, your own digital fight or flight, an experience followed slowly by a gradual curve towards mastery that is informed by the amount of time you spend hunting each genus of creature, and thus the time it takes to fell your prey drops exponentially the more you understand what they truly are. Hunts typically are on a time limit that, although stressful to think about, is more than generous, quickly becoming something of an afterthought. What starts as a 30 to 40 minute fight will eventually drop down to 10 or 15 with enough experience, getting to the point that eventually, should you find these creatures out in the wild, they barely register as a threat. That mastery is still present in Wilds. Already I can see that, despite the fresh coat of paint and frankly middling campaign story. All the bells and whistles of classic Monster Hunter have remained. Fights are electric, dynamic combat across multiple arenas with a ton of variety. You still have dozens, if not hundreds of ways of approaching each encounter through the diverse weapon loadouts and items such as traps and bombs. Now that you can have access to 2 weapons during a hunt, then swap between them at will, this variety only expands further. It's good. It's really good. And what's even more inspiring is how they've weaved that core experience into some really amazing set pieces, at times making the game feel as curated as an Uncharted or God of War, only still guided by your own skillful understanding of the rules of conflict. The execution is not the problem. So why am I still concerned? One of the things that started to creep into the series in the later games was this change in tempo on how loot drops informed the experience. Previously, as espoused by the diehards of the franchise, the mission to get all the required materials to build weapons and armor was a game unto itself. You would need to hunt each beast multiple times, even with luck on your side, in order to get everything you needed for each weapon upgrade and armor set. It was this setup that built the intimate relationship with each monster, that required you to understand what parts of it to attack to get specific materials and how to get the most out of each hunt. But as the series built itself up towards a more mainstream appeal, it started to get easier to obtain all the materials needed in fewer and fewer fights. Both World and Rise had it so that perhaps 3 to 4 attempts were all you needed to set yourself up for a full set of armor and an upgrade to more than one weapon type. And in my time with Wilds, for one beast in particular, the graceful, sophisticated Congalala, I got a full armor set from my first encounter, all 5 pieces. So my question is, if that was achievable from first sight, what then was my incentive to return to this great farting ape, to get to know it, to truly appreciate the work that had gone into making it feel real? Now, granted, this wasn't happening every single time I fought a beast in Wilds, and certainly there have been fights where those multiple encounters are needed depending on the luck of the draw, but it does feel like the game is treating the meta of these fights as an assumption that the repetition of old was a fault needing to be fixed, something that would certainly ring true for almost every other type of ludic experience apart from, specifically, this one. One thing I've noticed in my time with the game is that this new mechanic of focused strikes allowing you to target wounds seems to result in more loot drops. I don't know if this is explicitly true, but it would make sense for why my fight with the Congalala was so lucrative. I was annihilating their weak points with ruthless abandon, parts flying off the beast like water off a shaggy dog. It was a one-stop shop of brutal efficiency, but I came away from the experience none the wiser for who this wonderful creature actually was, except maybe just to stay away from its bottom. As I've been writing this essay, I've continued on my journey through the game, and this phenomenon, it happened again. In a Chapter 2 fight against an annoying trio of Hirabami, this one is kind of cheating a bit since there are 3 of them, but the result is very much the same. Fully kitted out from one fight, with enough materials to spare to deck my Palico out in a matching outfit. What is my incentive to seek more of these beasts out? What compels me to learn more about them now that I've retrieved everything I needed from that single encounter? This is where I need to go on a bit of a wanky tangent about how we engage with art, but I think it's irrelevant to the issues I'm having with Wilds. An audience is not a monolithic entity. We all have our own tastes when it comes to games, films, music, capital A art also. As a result, we inevitably end up valuing different things about creative works. For the Monster Hunter franchise, what I value about it the most, and the thing that got me excited to start playing these games back when World came out, was how brilliantly designed everything is, even on a purely aesthetic level. The monsters all look great, designs that at times feel truly alien, but at the same time like they could be real. They behaved like their real-world counterparts, attacking and recoiling as though you were a physical presence in each other's space and not just digital approximations. To truly appreciate the artistry at hand, I would strongly argue that you need that slow burn, that repetition of fights. It's the same reason the worlds and enemy designs of the From Software's Souls games are so lauded. When you spend enough time in a place or facing off against a particular foe, you end up truly appreciating the artistry that led to that experience. Blood, sweat, tears, a unified creative vision. This is the stuff dreams are made of. the things I find myself almost at the verge of a panic attack getting excited for. What I was eagerly anticipating in the lead up to launch of this latest entry, the result being something far from disappointing. All that mastery is still there, it's just the changes to the framework surrounding it that gives me pause. There's a lot of stuff I love about Monster Hunter Wilds, but it's not necessarily the stuff I love about Monster Hunter. Were this unburdened from the context of the past, I would happily call this a Game of the Year contender. It's so polished, so brilliantly inventive in its world and creature design. The weapons on offer kick so much ass to play around with, the set pieces evoke brilliantly the likes of Fury Road and Skull Island. It's a familiar game wrapped up differently enough to hold onto an identity of its own, but it really seems like it's in a hurry. Less an immersive world to explore and more an elaborate theme park ride. The campaign, while flashy and great for onboarding newcomers, also rushes through the game world and the creatures within it at such a brisk pace that it runs the risk of neglecting to show people what the game really is. Not just the fights themselves, but in navigating the world. I've sunk maybe 10 hours into the game at this point and been dragged across 3 distinct biomes, each one connected seamlessly to the next, but with little context for where those interstitial spaces exist in relation to one another. Where earlier games had missions, at least in the opening ranks, that just had you explore the world, harvesting mushrooms, mining ore, or stealing delicious monster eggs, there doesn't seem to be much of that here. The value of that more boring, busy work was a greater familiarity with environments, so that when it came time to hunt, you could grok the potential locations of your quarry and where they might run off to once you've given them a bit of a pasting. In Wilds, you move from fight to fight, often with the game cutting to black and dropping you into a new area, seemingly defeating the purpose of having this world be seamless. You spend so little time in these environments without having to focus your attention on your dangerous foe that you never really get a feel for how these maps stitch together or where pathways relate to one another. On multiple occasions when a monster made to escape me, I found myself at a complete loss as to which direction to head in to continue that pursuit. It's maddening because I never had this issue in Rise or World, and while I do think this issue is in part due to the map design not being as strong this time around and the visual fidelity not being as clean, there lies at the heart of all of this an undeniable truth. It's the small things that matter. A butterfly flaps its wings, somewhere on the other side of the world a tornado forms. If you alter the pacing and structure of Monster Hunter while retaining everything else, is it even still the same game? It could very well be that as I emerge from the other side of this main campaign and into the high-rank fights, that things settle into the more familiar rhythm of the older games, that familiarity eventually building with pride. But as a primer for newcomers, this sets a damaging precedent for a misunderstanding of what the game actually is. I'm not going to be so alarmist as to suggest that this is Monster Hunter for the TikTok generation, but as someone even vaguely familiar with the pacing and flow of the franchise, it very explicitly is not a good representation of why these games are so beloved. I fear that folk will hit that first set of credits none the wiser for what this game even is, beyond a flashy, slightly unusual RPG. It's an interesting dilemma to be presented with. On the one hand, the mechanical complexity of the game remains, and there is nuance to be found in your approach to each beast you face. On the other, these innocuous changes made to the flow of the experience, ones that seem definitively AAA in scope and execution, feel like a detriment rather than an addition. This is to say nothing of the concerning performance issues many players faced at launch, especially in the PC version, issues that can clearly be attributed to this expanded scope, a complex level of simulation, high-definition visuals, particle effects, and that seamless world, something I should add that never felt like it was missing from the previous games. All of these extra gubbins vying for attention and seemingly at the expense of the reason many of us are coming to the game in the first place. But maybe the changes are more welcome than I give them credit for. Monster Hunter Wilds has been immeasurably successful, having sold over 10 million copies in its first month alone. It's Capcom's fastest selling game by a wide margin, and this is even in spite of those performance issues being well documented and commented on. People are flocking to this game in droves, and series producer Ryozo Tsujimoto believes that this is partially down to the game's emphasis on story and inclusion of full voice acting. Now, given that this quote was in tandem with a discussion over the game's cross-play support, it could very well have been an innocuous statement, one that should not be taken too seriously, but given the trends over the last few games and Capcom's desire to bring new players into the ecosystem, one would not be out of order to voice their anxiety over what this could mean for the series' future. I'm not going to stand here and tell you that I know for a fact that the next entry is going to be some frictionless slop. Capcom generally have a good track record with the evolution of their franchises, but I've seen what popularity and that neoliberal desire for exponential growth does to artistic endeavours, and no one is immune to the allure of popularity, especially when there are shareholder interests in the mix. It's going to be a really delicate balance. The more folk engage with something, the more those collective tastes mould and form around that thing, eventually to the point that it becomes hard to know what exactly it was that shone so brightly in the first place. Every artistic endeavour is a journey through the lives of the people who created it and the people who engaged with it. It requires both parties to fully understand what it is that works so well and what it is that is in need of change, one to champion decisions made and another to hold steadfast in advocacy of those decisions that really mean something to them. An artist needs an audience, for sometimes they don't always understand what's good about what they've brought into the world, but in that same breath an audience would be nothing without that art, and sometimes to really truly appreciate something wonderful you need to be told to suck it up and travel along unfamiliar winds for a while. Monster Hunter Wilds is a great game in its own right. In many ways it has retained so much of the series' core identity despite this incremental glow-up. The monsters are still impressively lifelike, the combat mechanics are still kinetic and engaging, it's still a game full of specificities and bespoke creative work, but in our attempts to evolve, to diversify, to modernize, we must never forget the things that made it so special in the first place. One of the things I wanted to do in the process of writing this video was go back and look at some of the earlier Monster Hunter games, just to kind of get a feel for kind of what has actually, retained in transition, what's been lost. So I've gone back to good old trusty 3DS, been playing Monster Hunter Generations. It's an interesting experience. Obviously, drastically different from the more modern iterations, but at the same time, that chewiness is very compelling. The slow burn of it, the fact that, I had to, play for a full hour before I even got to my first big monster hunt, spending all that time collecting mushrooms and mining ore and fighting small beasts just to kind of get the feel. I think that stuff is important to the series as a primer for what you're actually getting yourself into. And that's one of the things I think is lost a bit in translation with this new game. Still good. I'm still enjoying the new one, but it's one of those things like stuff on. I mean, I know this is a legacy console now, but like stuff like this is still engaging. It's still worth spending time with. It's still worth getting into, brand new in a way. Games don't suddenly stop existing just because they're in the past. Anyway, how's this for a face reveal? Thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, the usual stuff, and I'll see you next time.